Hello, everyone, and welcome to State of Meta Frameworks. Ooh, I can't talk already. We're really excited to have you all here. We're going to be talking a lot about what's going on in the Meta Frameworks game. What's going on? We have a great panel with us today, and we're really excited to hear what they have to share with us. But before we get started, we want to thank our sponsors over at This Dot. A bit about who we are at This Dot. This Dot Labs provides architectural guidance, staff augmentation, on-demand subject matter experts, temporary CTOs, one-on-one pairing, mentorship, and open source strategy support. We are hiring, so check out our jobs page at thisdot.co/jobs. Also, if you're familiar with our brand, we do a lot of events, and we have so many amazing upcoming events, just like the one that you're listening in to today. Next month, we have State of APIs, where you can join us for the virtual event, State of APIs, where industry experts and thought leaders will gather to discuss the latest trends, best practices, and emerging styles in the world of REST APIs, GraphQL, and RPC. You can see me there, as I will also be hosting that event, so you get to hang out with me again. If you enjoy today, come say hi. We also have our Women in Tech monthly mentoring. We'll have the next one on August 16th. At this one, you can join Amelia Grayson to discuss a women's work-health balance. All women are welcome, and we're really excited to have y'all there. And if you enjoy what Ryan has to say today, Ryan's going to be hosting a Solid.js office hours with us. So whether you're just starting out or a Solid.js expert, come chat with us about everything Solid. We'll be learning about people's experiences, answering questions, sharing thoughts, and meeting other aspiring Solid.js developers. So come chat with Ryan, who is the author of the library, in this open conversation. Today, I'm your host. My name is Dustin Goodman. I'm an engineering manager at This Labs. I am also accompanied by my co-host.
Yeah, hello. I'm Mattia Maggi. I'm a senior software engineer in this lab, and I'm really happy to be here with these amazing guests.
And speaking of amazing guests, our panelists today come from all over the ecosystem and are some of the most amazing people. If you're not following them on Twitter or Zitter or whatever it's called today, you should definitely be giving them a follow, or if they have a different preferred social media, I'm sure they'll let you know. But today we're joined by Ryan Carniato, who is the author of Solid.js, like I mentioned. He's also part of the Marco core team. We have Ben Holmes from the Astro team, Maya Shavin, who is a Nuxt.js ambassador, but also a senior software engineer over at Microsoft. We're also joined by Andreas Ehrenkrona. I am so sorry. I knew I was going to butcher that. But he is the head of Crown Framework Development at Hyperlab, and he's also a Svelte maintainer. And we have Amy Dudden, who is the lead maintainer on the Redwood.js core team. Really excited to have all of you here. And with that, I think it's time for our first question, Mattia.
Yeah, let's start. So, okay, I start with this quite big one, and I'm curious to see all your point of views. So, where all these meta frameworks is it heading? Because we are seeing so much experimentation in the field, and I'm curious about thinking, where do you think we're heading when it comes to build a new application, web application in the next 5 or 10 years? Okay, let's start with Andreas.
Yeah, big question. I mean, obviously, it's if we knew what an ideal development environment would look like in 10 years, we would be building it now, right? So it's clear we're very much in this kind of funnel where we're experimenting with all kinds of solutions. I mean, it's an incredibly creative ecosystem, right? Things pop up overnight, disappear again. And I think it's just a natural part of technology development. Like we're seeing different things being tested out. Some work, some don't. At some point, we're going to converge again into some kind of consensus of how things are to be developed. How that's going to look like, it's a little bit hard to say, right? But it's kind of obvious that certain things are not working well with the setup we have. I mean, I think it's just random example. It's becoming increasingly obvious that hydration is a bizarre process that is inherently wasteful. If you were to design something from scratch, that would not be part of it. I mean, it's understandable from a historic perspective how we got here, but in some kind of idealized future, would we have it? No. So, Yeah, I think one big thing is like I would think like it's helpful to just think about not just the competition between our various frameworks, but the competition between the web and the apps. Because I mean, effectively, we're trying to keep up with mobile apps here, right? They are ahead on usability and on certain things. I mean, we're much faster in loading the first page. We don't have to download megabytes and megabytes of code, but after that, the UX is just better. So I think that's kind of also the bigger picture, and making sure the web is just competitive with mobile apps.
I think there's just a natural progression in general. There's always expanding and contracting as people adopt and accept new ideas. And I'm sure, as you mentioned, it will narrow down in the future. But right now, I firmly believe that rising tide lifts all boats. And so I think that that's probably the best advantage of having so many right now is that we're able to make each other better.
Yeah, and it mostly started, at least to me, from the bundlers and the tooling underneath meta frameworks getting very available, making it easy to make like a batteries included framework on top of, well, Vite is a major one. Snowpack is another option that came before it. TurboPack is something that's ongoing. All of these made it possible to take component framework ideas and turn them into meta frameworks, turn them into, routing conventions, API endpoint conventions, all of that stuff. I speak to that, working on Astro, which is built on top of Vite, SvelteKit built on top of Vite, SolidStar built on top of Vite. It is that rising tide that is making it really easy for everyone to build these frameworks. And everyone is so involved in the Vite core that everyone is just making it better at a crazy rate because we're, applying it to so many different use cases at once. It's not a single one. So all of that is breeding a lot of innovation and an explosion of ideas. And I understand how that makes JavaScript a very not approachable thing for new devs. I got a question on Twitch the other day from a beginner wondering where to start. And it's a struggle of I work at Astro, but also Next has a lot of documentation, but also Create React has a lot of prior art, but also you could use Ruby on Rails. So I just don't really know what to recommend. It's tough, and I think it's going to take a while and probably platform level changes for that all to catch up. And I have thoughts on that, view transitions being one of them, that we'll probably get into at some point.
Yeah, it is that complexity you're talking about, Ben. Largely, that's driven us more towards frameworks. I mean, it works both ways, right? Like, in a sense, this tooling that we have now has enabled amazing things, which has become basically our expectation of how we build. And then, on the converse side, actually setting up that tooling can be complicated to even know what pieces you need to put together, which kind of marks the rise when you combine that with return to server-side rendering, which for client-side frameworks is it's a little bit different. We had to basically run it in a whole secondary mode. We have the same code running both in the browser and on the server, and it has to be built up a little bit differently. When you add all that complexity, it's easy to see why someone would want to remove those decision points and then be able to just get started. I do commend projects like Vite in the sense that they've made it easier to have a common base, which has kind of allowed it be much easier for people to get into the space. But the truth is we would have gone to the space anyway because of this explosion in complexity. And I just hope that baseline like Vite continues to get higher to give us these tools so that the meta frameworks themselves never feel out of our reach, because one of the dangers of abstracting complexity is you get to a point where you no longer feel like you can build it yourself. And once you get too far from there, that's when you get these giant monoliths that people want to tear down or replace with something new. And it's often where a lot of the wasted effort comes in. So I think it's gonna be interesting over the next 5 or 10 years. Like there's obviously the technology that's like on the lower level libraries that's evolving rapidly, but just to see that balance between what are primitives that we can build our platform with versus like how all packaged in, like how much do you, like, for example, like you need to use a meta framework like Next to use React. Like how much is that the narrative versus, being able to just put the pieces together yourself?
I think that opens up a very interesting question, Ryan. which thank you for saying Next.js in particular, because server components, that's a very new hot trend happening in the React ecosystem, not exactly happening anywhere else currently. So, thinking about this 5-10 year experience, also thinking about maybe the past 5 to 10 years where we started in, server rendered PHP Rails applications. We started getting JavaScript and got good. We're building SPAs and we're doing everything on the front end now, back to, hey, let's start doing more server rendering and server component rendering. Like, how does that impact the narrative? If anybody here has an opinion on it.
Well, I think I have an opinion on that. I mean, I'm pretty opinionated about that, but anyway. So to put it frankly, I don't really like server component approach. I'm a client person, so just be really like anything that should be on the client should be on the client. I would like great. The server component is a great idea. It's a great idea, but that's a great idea. Stop at right there. You want to put it in the actual practical example or an actual application or use case, what real benefit can it give us if in comparison with just using PHP or anything that is already built ready for server-side rendering or server component instead? So yeah, I mean, I see Next.js is pushing for server component, and what it call, and Next.js also think they also have server components all the way, though I don't see the real gain from that. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but again.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to what Andreas mentioned before from a historical perspective, I know why we're here, but if we started from the beginning, would the tools look the same? And Dan Abramov tried to frame it that way recently. There was an extended blog post teaching React from server components first, talking about like, what if React was invented in the 90s and it used the same trends of doing things with server templating that we knew in the 90s, PHP, of course, being the classic example. And he taught it in that way, where JSX is that templating language, JavaScript is that server fetching language, and then client components become this thing that comes after, becomes this thing to insert levels of interactivity within those templates that you built in that 90s style. When you actually see it play out in the Next.js app router, it feels very, very different from how things were built in those other frameworks, having tried them. I am in a funny state of 90s web is before my time, so other people here might have better perspectives there. But it is funny to look at server components when you already have this client-side model that is highly capable and perhaps more capable for building dynamic apps, and then trying to move it backwards into server. But if you push it forward as let's start with server templating, then add client, it starts to make more sense. It's just funny when you deal with all the legacy concerns and educating the React ecosystem that it gets to be a sticky subject and something that is hard to adopt.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I mentioned Marco, because there was a framework that did actually go that other path when everyone went to single page apps, and they basically had an evolution very similar to, start with the server, add the client later. And in a sense, they didn't get to server components per se, or not yet, but it was a very different type of framework. It started with partial hydration and islands back in 2013, 2014. So in a sense, and I see it in Astro, right? We are seeing, that alternate universe kind of come to fruition around now. And that is actually what's fueling a lot of the innovation around different sorts of approaches are talking about hydration, because I don't know if the problem is just hydration itself. It's the fact that when we have this mentality that, what could go on the client should go on the client, we just end up pulling everything in there. It's just kind of the default. And to get away from that, it's funny, I've seen a lot of work having been done in the past to think of any possible way to kind of keep our client side mental model and continue on that path. React team was working on something that would allow them to do multi-flight requests, where they could send different pieces from the all over the UI in a single request and have it respond with all the data all over in a single request. And they ended up landing on server components because it was simpler. And I think, in a sense, I've used server components as an extension of islands. So it's like, how to put it? Like it's one of many technologies that are exploring the space of reducing JavaScript cost and execution in the browser. And in so, reducing things like hydration costs or any of the other kind of side effects that come from bringing a lot of JavaScript to the browser. But there are several explorations in this place. I mentioned islands. Obviously, server components. We actually been working on something very similar to server components in Solid Start, and also the resumability stuff that's in Quick and in the newer versions of Marco. So this is a zone where I expect to see continued innovation and experimentation. Although one thing that I found interesting is that on the meta framework side, while the underlying libraries are trying all these different approaches, there's been emerging patterns on the meta framework side in terms of how people want to put them all together to make them kind of usable at that next abstraction level. I got to give a lot of credit to, I guess, Remix and Svelkit. They've had them both at about the same time. When you look at the approach to handling progressive enhancement, when you look at the approach to handling not just forms, but mutations, actions, loaders, all those kind of patterns are ubiquitous now along the kind of meta client or sort of meta framework zone. Other things like server functions or use server, whatever, we're seeing these RPC type calls, automated. The number of patterns that I've seen kind of pop up from various places. Even the progressive file-based routing has actually been a huge amount of consolidation and agreement across meta frameworks. It's funny, I actually see more agreement across meta frameworks than I do across like the underlying libraries or frameworks, other than understanding what the problem is, but how to solve it, we're all attacking it a little bit different, but not so much on the meta framework side, at least from my perspective.
React Server Components is something that's pretty special or close to the Redwood team right now, just because we're incorporating that within our next epoch. And so we've been experimenting and seeing what that looks like, but we've always shipped with a backend piece or a backend component. It's been mostly focused on GraphQL. And then with this next release, trying to bring in that React Server Components element. And Maya, to your point, I think some of it is just because we've found that with the backend, there's a little bit more flexibility there, but also the things on the server is like open graph meta tags is important, and allowing Google to be able to crawl your website, like all those things that you don't necessarily get when you have a spa where you just have a single div tag with an ID and you're pumping stuff into that div. So there's pros and cons to both. And I think for me, I've just come to be at a point where like I really do appreciate opinions, because it makes it really easy to make decisions about things because you know where somebody stands and where a framework stands on a particular element.
I mean, to say something positive about server components, I appreciate at a sort of basic philosophical level that we're shipping HTML from the server to the client the way God intended it. But it's kind of the anti-islands, right? Like islands are just islands of reactivity inside a basically static container, whereas RSC is kind of the opposite. You have a fundamentally interactive page with islands of non-interactivity. And given a choice between those two, islands just seems more attractive, more logical.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I move with another question because probably Ben told something before about how a new developer could be scared when he or she jump in this world of meta framework. And there are many meta framework in a new meta framework or meta framework. So what advice would you give to a developer who is just starting to learn a new meta framework? And what are the learning curve associated with them?
I'll start with I'm sorry. So there are a lot of options, and the people on this panel are slightly biased by working on cutting edge frameworks that are filling out patterns and are also building a community and building a documentation ecosystem. So when I recommend tools, I have to be honest and follow where the documentation and where the ecosystem is. So when I speak to new developers, first off asking, what are you building? Sometimes if you're just building a personal blog or some like stand-up website for a relative, might be as easy as going to WordPress, or it might be easy to use templating options like Astro to just stand up a static site. Makes it easy to work with Markdown. Even though the community is slightly smaller, it relies on Remark and Markdown for most of the stuff you're doing, and that's a big community. So that's an easy one. And then if you're trying to do anything dynamic, if you're trying to build apps, or you're trying to get hired, that also matters a lot in your, decisions. I say this coming from, a technical college where all of the schools normally feed into React and Angular work. Because of that, I just say, React has been around since 2015. There are a million blog posts on it. Don't worry about server components right now because the ecosystem needs to catch up. Just learn the fundamentals of a component framework, React being the most popular one. And then from there, you can learn about meta frameworks to make it easier to work with that tool. If you wanted to start with Vite and React, or Ken C. Dodds' React Introduction course, which has been on Egghead for a long time, that's what I steer people to. And the meta framework part comes second. That's usually been my recommendation. I'm curious if other people have thoughts and if they recommend other tools, because, I love Svelte because it's easier to teach to new developers and other things, but I try to be smart just based on what people are trying to do with the tools.
Well, I usually would have to ask another question, that what's the level of the new developer? Because the question is pretty generic and you don't really have the full context of the person who asked the question. Let's say, what should I learn? But the right question is whether I already, if I already have a knowledge in JavaScript, what will be the next step? Or if I haven't known JavaScript, HTML, CSS, what should I do in order to get, what should I do in order to learn? So depends on what the answer here, I would tell them. But anyway, if the person is really new to front-end JavaScript, so I would tell them to go ahead and study JavaScript, HTML, CSS, get the fundamental of the base. And then from there, you can move up. I even can recommend them to try out jQuery if that would be that would help them understand how we work with some kind of like framework, the basic framework. Oh, sorry that. Yeah, so I have a kid here, like we said before. And
This
the
is a
next
family
thing
show,
I
y'all.
would say, yeah. So here you go. This is my kid. Nope, don't. So anyways, the next thing I would say is if they have already the fundamental on the CSS and HTML and how the web should look like, then the next thing will be, choose a framework. And that's what Ben said. Need to have more context. Also need to understand where they come from. Let's say in the US, maybe React and Angular is more popular, but maybe in the Europe or in China, somewhere East Asia, Vue will be more popular. This really depends. So, yep, that's it.
Yeah, I guess I echo that. Mostly that the meta framework, for me at least, is question that comes later. Often, to get started, you really just need to. I know there's no way to actually have a right choice. I mean, other than, let's say, React is the right choice, for example. But you basically need to just pick something. Doesn't matter. Just pick one of them. Something that it looks appealing to you, that you would want to learn, and then just try that. Build some simple stuff. Use the client-side framework the way you kind of do it on the client. And then, at a certain point, if you get to a point like, hey, I want to actually understand this, then we can talk fundamentals. But that's usually never what comes first. I am very much a fundamentals kind of person. I always talk about, mechanics. I always want to try and convince people that they can build all this stuff themselves, but they just don't want to. But that being said, there is something attractive about going from that first step of those simple online tutorials to being look, now you can deploy it. And I think there is a potential for the meta framework to fit into that zone, as long as there isn't too much going on. Sometimes that might mean having like a client-side render almost opt-out zone where you can just like say, yeah, just build client-side and you can still deploy it to your Vercel, Netlify, whatever. Often in the solid ecosystem, that's why we're always pointing people at Astro, because it like they can just start really simple and just take what they've learned in our tutorials and just drop it in. Hopefully with solid start will eventually kind of fill in that gap as well, but generally that's not the very first step. The truth of the matter, in my opinion, is unless there's some very important reason like job market or and these are important reasons, people or where you can get help and stuff, the choice of framework or library underlying doesn't matter as much as people will think. You will learn the same sort of stuff, the same sort of skills. If you find something appealing, you just might be more likely to continue with it.
Oh, I just want to add one thing to Ryan. I really agree with you on the way that it doesn't really matter. I mean, I started JavaScript developer, and every time when I go to a job interview, I think up until now, I think 2 or 3, and none of them really ask me if I'm fluent in React or Vue or anything. So, and in the end, after I got to the job, we learned at work what the framework we're going to use, and we learned since then. So it really doesn't matter in the beginning to start with, wherever you feel like more comfortable with. So.
And I think so many people get
Right.
paralyzed by like, am I going to make the right decision? And so then they don't make a decision at all. And they're just afraid that they're not going to hedge their bets in the right direction. But one of the things that I found is that a lot of the frameworks have similar patterns. And so once you get comfortable in one, it's easy to migrate or easier to migrate from one to the other. And then it becomes just what are you most comfortable with? What makes sense for you? What are those opinions that those frameworks have made, and which opinions do you align with? But Ryan, I really like what you said in terms of if you find something that you like, you're more likely to stick with it.
I mean, in terms of job market prospects, I would like to add a perspective that it can be actually quite useful to be on the cutting edge, because the very few companies that are using the framework that you have learned desperately need you, because there's also rather few people who know it. So it can be good to stand out by having learned some kind of obscure technology rather than being one of the 1 million React developers applying and who need to be retrained in whatever their future employer is using.
I think we all can appreciate that too. I think as consultants, we're definitely seeing a variety of different solutions being used. I mean, I can tell you I've talked to 4 different companies in the last 4 weeks, and somebody was like, yeah, we need Next help. I had another company be like, hey, we need SvelteKit help. Talked to a third, they're like, Angular, please. Another one was like, we don't even need a front end. We just need to talk back end. Let's talk about that for a minute. So, everybody has different needs and different requirements. So it is interesting to see kind of how it's developing and like what people are looking for as well. But Ryan touched on my bingo card. Actually, deployment was on my bingo card today. So I'd love to talk how you all are kind of doing your deployment stories in your different ecosystems. How you think people should be approaching deployment. Ryan, of course, was like, yeah, like when you want to get to the easy deploy, like just go do this. And I'm sitting here and I'm sorry, there's a little target at you, but like trying to do Nuxt.js deployment the other day on AWS, and I wanted to throw my computer out the window. So like, how are each of you?
You're not alone.
Well, there we go. But there's ways to do it, but like, how are each of you approaching that? Like, as maintainers, like, what are the challenges you're specifically facing when you're trying to make this easy for developers? Because I know one of the big challenges as maintainers is how do we make this as easy to get started using? How do we get it deployed? Like, key challenge. Like, yeah, tell me more.
Yeah, I know there's a pattern that a lot of meta frameworks have been adopting, and this is one of many areas that, I personally saw what SvelteKit was doing and thought, well, I think everyone should kind of pick that up. Adapters should be a familiar word, but it's a way for the meta framework to handle deployment to common services with very ready-made options. Like if you have a bundle, you might want to build it to static assets. That's nice for static sites. You just make some HTML templates and you put them anywhere. I'm not going to say AWS S3 is easy, but it's like moderately easy. Netlify and Vercel are definitely easy mode if you just want to get something out there. But for server apps that actually need to have servers, need to have backends, it's nice to have an adapter system that says, just add the Vercel adapter, and that will turn this bundle into serverless functions, and they work on this service. SST is also a really interesting one. It's this, not a wrapper on top of AWS, it's just this CLI tool and a bunch of other things to make putting the AWS bucket up there easier. And they have a Lambda adapter, where you say, take that framework, put the Lambda adapter, and all of a sudden it turns into Lambda functions. Just add your AWS credentials, and 30 minutes of dealing with environment variables later, it's on the internet. It's very nice because it does offload the problem to meta frameworks. It does make it hard to maintain. We have definitely run into issues with specific platforms that make it difficult to, have easy deployment to every platform. But for the common ones, like putting up a node bucket or putting up to serverless, we try to have those ready-made options so that if you just need a prototype on a simple service, it should be easy to do, and complex deployment options should at least have solid documentation. You shouldn't feel locked into any one option because it's the only one you know how to do.
I have to admit, this is my least favorite part about maintaining a meta framework. I knew it was going to be too. Like, I pushed back on like creating an official meta framework along this lines. You're right. I saw SvelteKit do the adapters on Beat, and that was like my inspiration of like, okay, it's time, let's do it. But then we all went and did the exact same thing instead of using the same thing. It's definitely the source of a lot of bugs. Every platform is a little bit different. And when we talk about it, there's the runtime considerations and the bundling considerations. They have different conventions. A lot of them have file-based conventions now where you can just stick stuff in the right place and it'll automatically wire up. But it's still like, when you start getting to platform-specific features that everyone who uses that platform wants, like maybe DSG or ISR and that stuff, you start getting into like a lot of complexity. So this is usually where I plug on.js, perhaps. I've also been working a lot on seeing if we could rebase Solid on top of Astro and then just use their stuff so they can take care of that for us. It's definitely a place that, in theory, you'd think it'd be great if we could have a common ground. In practice, it's probably harder than you would expect. But yeah, we do this work, and it's probably the most valuable work in my mind in the meta frameworks. So you don't have to, because at least in JavaScript, we're moving towards that convention. And as I said, I think it's SvelteKit and Remix that both first put it out there, where we use the web request and response objects and like web readable stream and all that stuff. And that does give us an interface that works from a like end developer standpoint on all of the platforms. But it's still a bit of a jump to go from, returning those web responses and getting to something that works in every platform. And we have stuff like WinterCG looking at standardizing those platforms. There's been projects, as I mentioned on.js and Nitro. There's HatTip, that have been looking at trying to generalize that runtime, build time piece. But I think there's still a lot of opinions in this space, so it's tricky to kind of weave through it and find the right mix for everyone. But in the meanwhile, I do spend a lot of time looking at other meta frameworks adapters and seeing what they're doing to solve problems like, cookie splitting. That's a random one. Web responses don't support cookie splitting, so we all had to do that. I'm pretty sure I grabbed it from Astro, who grabbed it from SvelteKit. So, that's kind of the state of things right now, at least in my mind.
So I'm hearing thievery is the golden art of meta frameworks. Yeah.
Just open source.
I
Yeah.
think the
Very
Picasso
simple.
one is hide your sources.
Amy, Andreas, anything y'all want to tap into this conversation? I know y'all have different stories in each of your ecosystems.
Yeah, I think the big. Oh, I'm sorry. I think the big thing for
That's
us
fine, go ahead.
is with Redwood, just like the perceived versus the actual platform limitations, or what hype versus reality is. And so sometimes what people perceive to be the fastest isn't necessarily the fastest, or just fighting marketing versus what reality is, and making sure that, like, if we're talking about a slow platform, that's not confused with slow redwood, because those things are not one and the same.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. I mean, in practice at Hyperlab, we've experimented with various containers, but we're just doing plain Docker deployments with Node and Express because it works fine. We don't see a compelling reason to switch, really. As exciting as it is that we're seeing all this experimentation.
Yeah, it's funny we haven't really mentioned Edge or serverless at all in these conversations. It's just put it where
I was
the
about
network's
to.
simple. All right, let's do it. Let's do it. Let's get into it.
No, actually, I'm using Azure. Like, I'm working for Microsoft, so of course, I'm using Azure. And I use Azure AF, serverless functions, and Azure CLI. I must say that they are great. As someone, they do it very fast, and all this ecosystem, all the experience is pretty nice, especially for VS Code and stuff. The only thing I don't like is that how I'm going to config, and somehow they have a different configuration between version and version, and the documentation is so bad. And it took me a while to set up the serverless function and trying to deploy anything to Azure. And at some point, I kind of switched what some of my open source projects to, instead of deploy using Azure, I just go back to Vercel or Netlify because it's much easier. But yeah, I hate the most. It's just the changing in the version and the changing on the API, and you have no idea where to start because nothing works.
Okay, let's change argument. And what do you think are some common misconception or misunderstanding about your respective meta frameworks that you like to clarify? Now you have the chance.
Oh, a big thing that we've gotten at Redwood is, oh, you guys are new. And like, oh, it's like we've been around for 4 years. We are stable, and just making sure that people understand we are a proper Redwood React framework, that we are a player in the space. So I think that's the thing is, like, yes, we have been around for a while, just people don't necessarily talk about it on Twitter or X or whatever the name is this week.
Yeah, I know y'all reintroduced yourselves, and I'm assuming, I don't know if that's part of it, but I know it's reframed as, built for startups, built for people trying to create stuff. And y'all don't go as much for Twitter hype as much as going straight to the people that are trying to build things and say, here's exactly how you do it. I don't know.
Yeah.
I actually am curious how your sort of developer outreach looks there. Like, do you go for marketing or do you go to specific users?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we really have focused in on startups, and the cool part is, maybe we need to do a better job of telling this story. So now's our opportunity. But the startups that we know of that have told us how much they've raised almost $70 million in funding, which is pretty incredible that there is core infrastructure built on top of Redwood. And so that's not always a story that gets known because it's not the social chatter. But we have opportunities for startups. We partner with different startup incubators and have a startup club, and really try and focus on those end users in that particular market right now. So hopefully we can continue to expand that as Redwood continues to grow and develop.
Yeah, that's a cool metric. It's not how many users does the project have. It's how many dollars is that project built on top of.
Right. And like core infrastructure.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I can also keep the floor for Astro. I like to say Astro's not just for static sites. This has been going for a while because Astro bursts on the scene as like, oh, it's the new static site generator. It's the new Gatsby, which in my mind is true. It is a really nice way to build static sites, use whatever framework you want, including React, and put it up with any deployment adapter. But I've been playing with a lot of new patterns, like using Astro SSR, which is a way to just take every template you already built and just put it on a node server instead. So instead of this template being a one-time built thing, it's now something that can take in a request, do some logic, and then send back a dynamic template, depending on what you put in, whatever query params you requested with. And when you do it that way, it feels like the modern Express.js to me, where instead of having these endpoints that are written, with JavaScript and using pug templates to return HTML, you now have these endpoints that are file-based routes returning JSX or whatever you want for a modern templating language. So if you're trying to build a server that can return both JSON and also just HTML responses, if you have that architecture, then Astro is this natural fit to just move on to the new request response standards and still deploy to a node server, still put it on your Docker container in roughly the same way.
Ben, I have to ask this because big Astro fan. My personal site's built on it. Sorry, the rest of you. I use you for other stuff. But on the documentation site, like it used to say, hey, if you're trying to build, large scale enterprise applications, Astro might not be for you. Would you say that conversation has changed for Astro?
I'm not sure if that is the primary focus, because when you're building a meta framework, you have to be careful to not sell it as the solution to all problems. That's why we say, all right, our biggest strength is content sites, because we got Markdown and MDX nailed. All the headless CMSs have guides or first-party integrations. So let's go all after that. Content sites, marketing, blogs, docs, e-commerce. Those are the ones. And the emerging story, I guess, is that other flip side of the spectrum, where now you want something fully dynamic. Like you have this Create React app, you have this spa that's already built and mounted on this other tool. But what if you could just plop that into an Astro route? You can make it a wildcard, you can take in every request and just send it to the spa, then use Astro to make endpoints and these other things. And now you can build the marketing page with static templating, so all of a sudden it owns both like your admin panel and your homepage that you already built with static content. So that's a cool pattern that doesn't have as much prior art. It's not something that people have tried as often in the wild, but seeing tools like Solid Start looking at, building, app frameworks on top of it. I know Tanner Lindsley has also looked at putting his routing solution into an Astro bucket. That's when you start to see Astro just this very generic thing that takes in a request and you can do whatever you want. So sky's the limit on what you want to build on top of it. But the APIs are definitely built for that content focus.
And you guys, we've already seen this pattern get applied in some large companies. NordVPN and Capital One both use Astro with that kind of setup where they have the static pieces and they have some dynamic single client rendered apps built with actually Solid of all things. That's why I know about this. But this is a cool kind of combination of being able to take these, mix your content sites, mix your dynamic pieces, and have that kind of story for even some larger customers.
Yeah, and I saw Dev joke in the chat, it's the meta framework. Oh no, do they cancel each other out? But it really is that funny space of, it's the meta framework that doesn't care what components you use. So that means you can mount them in any way. You can flip off server rendering if you want. There's no hydration requirement. You could say client only, and then just mount a spa instead. It's really up to you how you want to wield the tool. Just bring your favorite integrations.
Yeah. I guess I'll go now. Misconception about Solid Start. I don't know if there's a ton. I've been pretty vocal about the fact that I don't actually like meta frameworks. I'm building one not because I like them. My hope is that through the work we do in Solid Start, we can raise that baseline of primitives in such a way that we can use only existing libraries in the ecosystem other than this deployment layer, runtime piece that I'm hoping to ship off to someone else to maintain. So in general, this doesn't mean that there isn't a need to put opinionated stuff together, but my biggest goal with Solid Start is actually show that all the pieces can be made in such a way that are generic. And that obviously applies to Solid, but it could apply to others. This is really the source of what interests me in this space. I have to admit, we have some people who have taken Solid Start to production, and it's not like it would go away in that form. It's just my biggest interest is actually making sure that we don't get into a locked-in future. And I don't mean locked-in frameworks, because obviously when you choose a tool, you choose a tool. I don't really care about that. I meant in a future where it seems daunting to the point that like you have to choose a meta framework to even do anything. That is not a future that I'm interested in.
I mean, I could go next. I'm kind of sitting on two chairs here because I mean, on the one hand, I work for this company called Hyperlab, where we've developed our own meta framework that we use in-house for e-commerce solutions. On the other hand, I'm a Svelte maintainer, but actually I haven't been particularly active there for quite a while now. So I can't speak that much to SvelteKit, but I can say something about Crown, which is, I mean, I feel I'm the one most interested in the commercial aspect here. And obviously we're selling licenses to Crown, and it's a bit of a challenge to even explain what is a meta framework, what does Crown do, why should you pay money for this thing? It can be really, really difficult. The big selling point is partial hydration. That's why we built it. Svelte is really fast already, but with partial hydration, we think we are as fast as it's currently possible to get. Would love to try out Quick at some point, but anyway. And that's essentially the selling point. That's what we're telling our customers, but I think they have a very vague idea about what this whole thing is, except that it makes sites fast.
Might want to add anything about Next?
I would love to, though I'm not a maintainer of Nuxt. So, you know, it's hard to comment because I'm not the maintainer of Nuxt. I'm just ambassador. Though I think one of the most common thing I ever heard every time when I try to explain to anyone about Nuxt, now it's better, that someone would say Nuxt, do you mean Next.js and not Nuxt? Even Google try to correct me several times every time when I Google Nuxt. So first of all, Nuxt is not Next, so that's a misunderstanding. And even though it sounds very much similar to Next.js, I don't think that Nuxt is the Next.js version in Vue. It have more they have more features, and it follow a more like a developer experience, an easier developer experience with a lot of module on it. I've been working with Node.js for some time, and it's great because we build on Vue, and Vue is awesome. So it's way better than React. That's my I mean, I like Vue, so that's why I'm saying that Vue is better than React. But anyway, well, did I just say that out loud because I'm working with React at work? So, no, okay. Back to the topic. So Next.js, think it's more performance, very optimized, and they go forward to the static site generator recently. I still like the server side rendering things because the team is doing an amazing job there. But switching between version to version is still what I don't like so much. I have an open source module that for Nuxt, and I keep delaying upgrading it to the latest version because they have breaking changes, and yeah, so developing a framework or meta framework is not as easy as anyone would think, and the misunderstanding that you think that it's easy to fix bugs and just release a new version, it's not like that. It took months.
I think that open source comment actually just triggered something in my head that I wanted to ask all of you, which is the testing story. So I'm gonna blame React for this one. So it's none of your faults. It's nobody's fault. But I've been noticing very frequently with a lot of the new libraries and frameworks alike, there's been a very conscious decision to move away from first-class testing. Like I'm seeing less Jest in everything. I'm seeing more Cypress or Playwright. I mean, SvelteKit specifically, they're shipping with Playwright out of the box now. Nobody else ships with testing. They don't have a preferred testing anymore. I know for years we were all looking at Kitsy Dodd's testing library, and I'm sure we've all used it and still love it for what it is. But there's a lot of things that just aren't working the way it was. Storybook's not really there. Feat test, I noticed this is more on Quick, but it wasn't working out of the box with them by default. I don't know if the same statement could be true with Solid. Mattia would know better than me on that. And Ryan, you would know better than both of us. But, you know, kind of what's the move for this change? Like what is encouraging you all, or maybe the community, to kind of make the move towards less first class unit testing, more end-to-end testing? Why are we choosing end-to-end testing frameworks at all? And are we going to see a shift back towards kind of our old testing patterns, or do you think that's the way of the past and we have a future ahead of us?
I know with Redwood, we actually do ship with Jest. We do ship with JavaScript testing library. We ship with Storybook. So we try and encourage all of those best practices in terms of unit tests for everything. And I think a huge part of it, what makes that piece difficult, is that managing all of the integrations. As those libraries are changing, trying to stay up to date on that, as we're evolving, trying to make sure that all those pieces are continue to be supported. And so for us, we've taken that responsibility on us to prevent somebody else from having to maintain that and keep everything up to date on their end. But I think in general, there's pros and cons to both. There's pros for unit testing. That way, if something breaks, you know exactly what it is. But there's also pros for end-to-end testing. You want to make sure that everything works together. And if it doesn't, then it still doesn't matter if an individual component works if it's not talking and working well with others. So you almost need both in order to have a successful application, or at least to have the confidence in your application.
Yeah.
Well, I am a maintainer. Oh, sorry, Ryan. Sorry. So I'm a maintainer. I used to be a maintainer for a component library, and I'm still a maintainer of my work component library. So I think it depends really. The question about first class unit testing, it really depends on what kind of framework are you building, whether it's like a general JavaScript framework like React, or it's a component specific framework. Let's say if a component specific framework, we still need unit testing for the component, and we still ship with Storybook because you believe what you see, like you get what you see. So we still need to showcase our component and how it works, and to see whether it's really work in context of accessibility and stuff like that. So it's important to have both the Storybook and unit testing. And in the end, we still need to ship with integrated testing or Playwright, like end-to-end testing, because these component framework on itself cannot work alone. They have to work with something. So it's a must to trying to write some sample app, trying to test it end-to-end to see that if we're missing anything, the standalone can be great, it can be accessible, but put together it's not. So it's really the questions about first class really vary per circumstance. Yeah.
I mean, you need to test what is the stuff that's going to break, right? Like it's not about having 100% test coverage. It's about making sure your app will not break in production. So you need to look at like where is the complexity and where the bugs being created. And I think it depends a little bit on what kind of application you're building. But I do think the kind of e-commerce solutions we're building is sort of broadly representative of many websites out there, in that the complexity is largely not in the component code. Like our components are very simple. There's data transformation, there's caching, there's integrating data from various third parties. That's kind of the essence of what our systems are doing. So where do our bugs appear? Well, it's typically in there somewhere. It's the data transformation. You have a flag in one format coming from here, and it doesn't fit to what this component over there expects. And if you test the component in isolation, you will not figure that out. And there are ways of breaking this up into separate tests. You do an integration test towards the API, you check that it returns a known format. You take the same format and feed that to the component, and also you do an assert somewhere else that that's the same format as the one you get from the API. But this is all very complicated. It's a lot of testing code to keep track of. It's hard to explain to beginning developers. It's much easier to set up a Playwright test and say, go to HTTP localhost 3000, click on this button and assert that you're on a new page. So I think it's a combination of like, where is the actual complexity, and it's not frequently not in the logic and the components, and just ease of use.
Yeah, I find it difficult to be prescriptive about stuff. I don't like pushing certain opinions, but testing I find even harder. than some of the other ones, because like, yeah, for the longest time we get these templates and we'd have the testing built in with this really like simple example. You'd have like app dot whatever, and then you'd have app dot test dot whatever, and then like it would be like, I passed this prop, yay. And the thing is, when we've moved into this world of server-side rendering, holistic systems, client and server, you do need something like a Playwright. Like you do need like something more. And I don't know if those always play as well into those really simple template examples that we put in our repo, so to speak. So like when I test solid start, like our internal tests, yeah, we use Playwright and whatever, because like snapshot testing in the sense, or like that's not exactly snapshot testing, but like essentially having these like holistic tests are the best way we can find to actually test the whole system. But I mean, again, people are still going to use stuff like vtest, because all our templates are built on V, including solid start being built on V. Vtest is like everywhere now in the solid ecosystem. People use it. But it's a place, Storybook again is another one of those examples where like building components is mentioned 100%. If I'm building an application, maybe not. So it's, yeah, I think different meta frameworks come in at different levels in terms of the opinionated, and in terms of how much decision they want to leave and how far they want to get their users. So yeah, testing is probably one where it seems almost obvious that it should be there, but actually finding the right balance. I think it was cool for single page apps for a time that we found that really nice sweet spot. I think we're still on the SSR future right now, trying to find if there is one. I mean, there might be some good solutions, and I want to spend some time looking at what some of you all have done in this space. But so far, like, I haven't had that moment of like eureka, like this is the thing that I could feel comfortable. And honestly, I'm a pretty stiff judge on that, because like, as I said, I don't want to ship anything to anyone that they don't want.
I definitely appreciate that. I also asked this question kind of selfishly. We have a open source project that we've been maintaining called Starter Dev at this dot, where we've been trying to bootstrap. We don't do Redwood because it's already so comprehensive on its own. Astro, in a sense, we're starting to figure out like, hey, what's the future of that look like? But we're trying to create like these boilerplate kind of starting packs of like, hey, here's the framework setup, here's all of my CSS plugins working out of the box, here's testing, storybook, linting, like everything I need to like kickstart, configure a project. I don't have to spend an hour or two like figuring out what I want to do there. The choices are made, and I can just start working on features and components. And one of the conversations that we have been having a lot very recently is testing doesn't work. Now, this has been very specific to Next.js and actually Nuxt.js, not to get confused with one another. Nest has been fine just because we have all three. But, it's been interesting to kind of see how those stories have kind of been evolving and how we're trying to solve them. And also to pick your brains on like, hey, how should people be solving them? And I kind of like this, maybe not general answer, but kind of good of like, hey, it kind of depends on what you're doing. Like if you're doing the component library, some level of component testing is going to be good for you, but really maybe consider something more pervasive like end-to-end testing, because that'll actually cover the use cases you're worried about. And I think that's something we all need to keep in mind. I definitely know that's something I've been trying to solve for myself. So really glad to hear some of the thoughts y'all have had on this. This is enlightening for me, if nothing else. So sorry, everybody else, if you didn't get any value out of that, but I sure as heck did. We did have a couple of questions from the audience. I'm going to pull this one out. People are kind of curious. I know earlier documentation has been mentioned at least more than once, but kind of the question right now is, what do you think of Docusaurus as people who are maintaining their own docs? Is this something you like? Do you use something else?
Well, I mean, I gotta jump in here a little bit, because at Astro, we did put out a new documentation starter called Starlight that is built to take some of the things that people like about Docusaurus and bring it into, a static templating language open to any framework. And it's something that we're, porting back into our own Astro documentation site. So, the content meta framework in the room, we're going to try to have some opinions about documentation. But of course, it's pre 1.0, still building up features because Docusaurus has been around for a long time. And I know they had a fresh start as well, moving from Angular to React. I don't know how many years ago at this point. So my general opinion is Docusaurus is going to have the most out of the box stuff from the ecosystem of JavaScript tools that I've tried. But I do like more server focused systems, working at Astro, seeing how content sites could be built mostly statically. So that's what I'm most excited about, is to lower the JavaScript bundle, but keep giving you those cool features that Docusaurus kind of pioneered, like, fun remark plugins to have tooltips and have tab bars, because every documentation site kind of converges on that. We need to feel like a Stripe documentation site. That's the holy grail. So if you can have those conventions, then it's really nice to use.
If I say I haven't heard about Docusaurus until today. Was anyone laugh at me?
It's
I mean,
the
I know.
yeah, just to
Sorry?
clarify for those that don't know what it is, it's one of Meta's open source projects for doing documentation.
I forgot to explain my
Yeah.
terms before I went off
Yeah.
the deep end. But yeah, it's a documentation framework built on React. There you go. That's the definition.
Okay, great. That explains the dinosaur logo.
Well, I'll throw this out there as somebody who was involved in the project, but it was interesting because when Dan and Rachel started off on the React 18 documentation process, they didn't use Docusaurus. They actually went Next.js, and all of it is just custom React components at this point. So it's been interesting to see that path. So it's almost the I'm gonna plug Starlight here, but it's the Starlight path of like, let's do MDX right.
Oh, well, for me, I'm using Nux content. So like I have Nux contents, and maximum I have a markdown. So probably MDX, but that's it. I mean, I know I read about Astro a lot.
In the Vue ecosystem, there's also VuePress and VitePress. I don't know the difference between those, but
well, like VFresh is a better version of VuePress. VFresh come first, and VFresh come after Vite is released, and somehow now everyone moves in VFresh. And then we also have like Grissom, but this died unfortunately during COVID, and so now we have Nux and VFresh and VuePress, and I only use Nux content and VuePress.
But yeah, I can say we definitely looked at Nux content a bit because Astro also wanted that cool convention of, we're not going to give you this full framework for here's how you make the documentation look good. We'll leave that to a separate starter. But we want this convention of, you want a bucket of Markdown, MDX, or just some rich text content and a cool way to query it to turn it into pages. And I know y'all went a MongoDB querying route that is really flexible to that, where you can just say find and then the list of the docs that you want. And in Astro, we went with a more sort of specific path of, you can put a directory of content and then fetch that directory, and it has type safety for the front matter in that directory. So if you want those kinds of tools, it's more flexible if you want to go one layer deeper. And I just want really nice Markdown parsing, I'll make the website. And that's, another case of have those layers of abstraction so you can do it yourself and drop further down without having to reinvent the universe.
Any other
The
thoughts
moment
about
of quiet. Sorry. The moment of quiet.
Any other thoughts about Docusaurus or documentation tool?
Yeah, it's not something. For the most part, we just send people over to Astro, but it is something that we definitely think about in terms of building, the baseline. Our earliest, what I call it, client-side routed islands or server component type experiments were actually based on doing a bunch of MDX processing. So you could use MDX with server component kind of scenarios, and we built SolidStart's doc site on it. It has some scrolling restoration issues on the navigation, but we kind of dog fed it as a way, but no way near the same kind of feature set. But I do think of these other tools. But I do think it's interesting place where it's one of the most obvious places where you can benefit from having a highly amount of static content, patterns like islands and partial hydration, and a fun place to feel the difference between, say, adding client-side navigation or not. So that's one of the interests, at least I have on the doc side, because obviously above that foundation is a whole bunch of feature sets. People build whole frameworks off it, like Docusaurus or Starlight. Well, I guess Starlight's not like it's specialized templates, I guess, but I think it's interesting to see how this. I guess Nextra is another thing built on Next, like to see how the core pieces kind of fit into that story. And I think the focus on partial hydration will only make doc sites even better.
I don't have a specific opinion about Docusaurus. We are using it for our documentation, but just to contribute a little bit, Supabase has an interesting conversation about how they, like a blog post that they wrote about moving from Docusource to Next. And so it's just kind of interesting how people are moving to where they're going to get the most flexibility and just kind of what their audience needs in terms of the components and the information that they're providing.
Okay, cool. Probably we have another question from the audience. Yeah, Brian is asking, is transpiling really a necessary technique anymore, and why? Also curious, what are the meta framework vibes on the practice known as infra as code? Who wants to go first?
Pick it on Ryan, just because I know he has an opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it depends what you call transpiling. Like, if you're talking about like modernizing stuff to ESM, I think we're getting very close to a point where we can get that baseline now, where for a lot of libraries and a lot of things, you can be like, okay, I want to target, ES6 2016 and, be in a pretty good place. That being said, like all our work is all bundling and compilers all the time. I mean, Svelte, Vue, even Astro, solid, like it seems very unlikely. Like when you consider to get that kind of optimal performance that we want, get all the optimal pieces, it seems unlikely to remove that piece altogether. Tree shaking, partial hydration, like if anything, we're seeing the bundlers getting like pulled into the framework. First the meta frameworks, but even the frameworks themselves, essentially. So like tooling is a big part of stuff. Even if you could mechanically not need to do it, you'll never get the best results. So like I don't see that going away. Sorry, what was the second part of Brian's question? Curious, meta framework vibes, infra as code. Yeah, I mean, I think we might need to get to a point where we expose more of that. Right now, we're using the fact that we can use a lot of conventions. We can use like file-based kind of generation where you can go like put stuff in specific locations, and then a lot of infrastructure providers like Netlify and Vercel's build output APIs. They let you like put stuff in certain locations and have certain config files, and we can generate that, and it makes it a lot easier to target for the meta frameworks when we can like basically take some sort of convention and wire it up automatically from things from like specific export patterns like you find in Remix, or file name conventions you find in SvelteKit, or all these kind of pieces. You will find that like we're trying to automate a lot of those pieces, but I think at a certain point, when you start getting a list of exports, like export pre-render, export loader, export whatever, you can get like 10 of them. We are getting to a point where we're, I don't see it being that far off that we start getting more fine-grained configuration considerations, because like, how do you break up we're building monolithic projects and expecting them to be deployed distributed. So like, there's this question is like, where do these functions go to? Do these like API routes go to a single function? Do they go to a bunch of different functions, like serverless functions? Are they going to the edge? Are they, can you break this up? Can you not break this up? Do these things need to be bundled together? And as much as we try and automate that, I think there's going to be a need for some level of control there. All the platforms I talk to have been really trying to do a convention-based thing, but I guess we're going to have to see where that ends up.
Yeah, the infra part is interesting to me, correct me if I'm getting terms wrong. I definitely could be. But I've been watching what Next.js has done recently because they own both a framework and a place to deploy that framework. So naturally, they'll have some interesting ideas for how to tie the two together seamlessly. And they're starting to have these almost magic opinions on where each route goes. Where when I spin up a Next project, I don't have to say, these routes are serverless, these routes are static, I want to adapt to this service. Instead on Next, I just author code, and based on the fetch calls that I'm doing and whether it thinks I'm doing dynamic stuff, it'll decide, you know what, I'm going to deploy that page to a Lambda and this page to static. You didn't have to tell me which one to put it on. I figured it out based on how you were typing your code there. And that's the first framework I've seen do that. I think SvelteKit has smaller conventions there where it'll sort of have an auto setting that I saw in the documentation. But it's an interesting one because in one breath, it is moving the goalpost in a way that you might not know about. As a beginner, I may not know that little Lambda symbol means it's going to charge me per request on my Vercel bill, and I did not know that before deploying. So that's the scary part, is it assumes the author knows how to code the website perfectly, and it is going to infer from that. So I do like how Astro has done it so far, where it's very explicit. You have an export on each route saying, is it server or static? And you can set the default in your config whether the whole app is a server or the whole app is static, and you can flip each route to the other way if you want to. But I am watching what they're doing, because it seems like, because they own the infrastructure, they want your code to sort of adapt. They've called it the SDK for the web, where they sort of know how to deploy it to the smartest server, to the smallest runtime possible. And yeah, we're getting in really interesting territory there.
I just want to say about the transpiling. I mean, the second question you guys already answered. The transpiling process will always need it unless you write it in vanilla JavaScript. Otherwise, whatever you write in React or even TypeScript, you still need a transpiler to transpile the code from what you write into the actual JavaScript that browser can understand. And even the JavaScript that the browser can understand also can be not the JavaScript that you are written on your side, because it can be like something with the mismatch version and so on. So it's always there. It will be there.
I mean, I guess the question about transpilation is this dream of getting rid of all this very, very complicated build steps that we have and these hundreds of megabytes of downloads of Babel and God knows what is being sucked down every time you run. But ultimately, I guess the days that where we could just write a script and paste it into a browser and test it that way, I think they're over. Unfortunately, possibly.
I think you don't need Babel anymore, right? Because I think you can use Vite transpile pretty well. Like they have a mechanism inside. Yeah, Babel
it's improving
huge,
massively. It's improving massively.
Yeah.
I mean, it used to be much worse, and I'm happy to get rid of some of these old massive frameworks. But it's, I mean, the whole build process is still a hassle.
Well, I never figure out how to use Babel, so I'm happy if it's gone.
I mean, both of these questions are like the beauty of meta frameworks, right? You don't have to worry about these things when you're just building a website. You rely on somebody else to provide that structure for you.
Well, I think let's move on to something else, unless anybody else has something they want to add to this. But I think something we were curious about is, what are some interesting challenges each of you have kind of discovered in this development process of the meta frameworks? I know Ryan mentioned earlier the testing story, but he's also mentioned a few other things that have been of particular challenge to him. But curious for the rest of you, like as you've been partaking, as you're trying to solve problems, like what do you find to be like hardest or most interesting challenges that you're facing? Amy, I'm going to pick on you.
Yeah, I was just reviewing my notes because so I asked for feedback on some of these questions from the team to see what are some of the other challenges that other people on the team have incorporated. And a big piece for us has been GraphQL. So Redwood has a GraphQL API on the back end, and there's been some perceived challenges with that just because not everybody likes GraphQL. But there have been challenges for us in terms of incorporating that and allowing people to like use it in such a way that allows their applications to scale. So it does solve issues with like overfetching and waterfall problems. And then using those conventions that we provide to be able to introduce fragments with GraphQL. And now that we're using React server components, that will make that transition with data even more easy. So they solved a lot of issues that people deal with, all those things on the back end to make that as simple as possible. I know when I've written code with GraphQL before, the frustrating thing for me is I feel like I'm writing it multiple times. And so with Redwood, they handle a lot of that for you where you don't have to rewrite it. It makes it lifts up those conventions that people use. So I know that there was a lot of complicated things that other people solve for me that I didn't have to solve before I came on the team. So just highlighting the work that they did in that regard to solve those difficult problems.
In the Crown framework, a lot of our focus has been on caching. So again, that comes from just the environment we're in, where we're totally dependent on third parties to supply data, and frequently these third parties are not fast enough. So I mean, you have caches at all levels. Like there's in-memory caches, there are persistent caches, typically Redis. There's HTTP caching, and we actually brought that concept into the Crown framework, where we're using decorators to indicate what data should be cached, cache time. We're using Stillwell revalidate patterns to update the data in the background, so we have fresh data but can still serve immediately. I mean, that's still, I'd say, an ongoing process, but then also adapting the HTTP headers to correspond to the shortest TTL of the data we're fetching in the background. Trying to integrate that is maybe one of the more interesting things we're doing.
I'll talk anyways. For me, actually, yeah, the deployment adapters and runtime pieces have definitely been the hardest, not just because of what I mentioned earlier, but because it's tricky when every platform supports different features and trying to figure out a balance between providing a generic interface or you just build your app and choose you can deploy anywhere, and figuring out like, how do I specifically leverage this one platform? There's this lowest common denominator problem, and in theory, it might be best if we could use the underlying platform's ability to expose their conventions or configuration in a way and expose it to the end user, and then be like, look, if you want these features, maybe you can just use them directly. But that's not always really an option, and to make everything play nice is really challenging. And the danger of tucking it all in the framework is that you end up with features that might feel like too platform specific, like stuff on, say, Next only works well on Vercel. And to go the other way is, as I said, really a big ask, because you have all your built-in patterns in the framework, and then if the platform starts offering these specific features, how do you possibly integrate them? That's why I've had a lot of interest looking into spaces where others have been trying to solve it. As I mentioned on JS before, which is trying to generalize KV stores or stuff like that, just because there are some common pieces, but that's that go beyond just the runtime, but it's tricky because they're innovating too. Like the edge and serverless is innovating at a rapid rate while we're trying to innovate and trying to hoist it all in without any kind of standards and all these different product offerings is really difficult.
Ben, Maya, would you like to add something?
No, they already add everything. I mean, for my side, just to make sure that how it can work in different platform, backward compatibility and stuff like that. So it's not a way that I have a solution for it. But,
Okay, so maybe Ben could start with the next question. What are some of the most innovative or unexpected ways you've seen your frameworks being used?
Interesting. Man, I'm on the spot. So there have been some surprising customers, I guess, that have used it before. I know one out in the wild was seeing Bloomberg experiment with using Astro to template for news articles, and it was done not in a wholesale way. It was, depending on just the user, you were served an A/B test where some routes were serviced by Astro and the rest were serviced by the framework that they were using. So that definitely made me think, okay, first off, Astro is easy to just slot into a deployment platform because it's not this big server bundle necessarily. You can use Astro to build some HTML templates, and whatever server you have, you can just route traffic to those routes if you ever need to. So it's this nice add-on to whatever service you're already trying to build. And that got me thinking about, well, how can this be integrated other places? Astro has a middleware mode as well. So if you want to deploy Astro as a node server, you can also just deploy it as a node server middleware. So if you have an existing node server, you can put Astro as middleware for some of the routes, and it'll serve those from an HTML bucket. So there's even less you have to do. If you already have a server written in JavaScript and you just want Astro to service some parts of the website, to experiment with it for a homepage or for existing user testing. So that's been the most interesting one to me. I'm not sure it's surprising because we're using it for content. The crazy one has been, like TanStack putting a full routing system into Astro. That's a new one for me because it's this other wave of using client-only routers with some SSR options to do things in a different way. Not doing file-based routes, doing config-based stuff, doing hardcore, this is a SPA first. And that's a route that I'm interested in because we were told that was a bad idea. But for certain cases, maybe it's not. And it's up to us to figure out which patterns that's actually a better way to go.
I'll go. With Redwood, I think a big thing for us has just been the diversity of use cases for production applications. So we have some consumer non-traditional like CLI examples. We have integrations with Slack. We have CI pieces with pull flow. Then there's just like deep vertical SaaSes. There's configurations on the API side, multi-client. There's machine learning backends. And then, as I mentioned earlier, just having just shy of $70 million worth in funding has been a big deal for us and something that we definitely want to celebrate.
The question was unexpected. Oh, yeah. Okay, I got one. People have been using Solid, like some companies are using Solid Start to build their website, ship them production, even though it's in beta. Crazy people. But then they start coming to me, and this is the thing that actually surprised me, is they built Solid Start sites in our client-only mode and started using it to build Electron apps and mobile apps. I did not see that one coming right away. I mean, I guess I should have anticipated it, but there's a lot of stuff like a Dominator on top of native script and stuff where you can basically build on top of very web-like APIs to build native experiences. And they just went ahead and just configured Solid Start a slightly different way, hacked in some stuff into the main HTML document, and ta-da, they have a mobile site. So, very interesting, different use case. And now that's on my radar, I'm definitely thinking about, a future where Solid Start could also support mobile development.
This isn't really about meta frameworks, but the craziest thing someone has built with Svelte seems to be the winner of this year's hackathon by the Svelte Society, which is Wolfen Svelte. It's a remake of Wolfenstein 3D in the browser. But that's not even the crazy part. The crazy part is that they're not using Canvas, they're not using WebGL or anything. It's just DOM elements with CSS 3D transforms that represent the walls, and somehow they get that to run smoothly. And I mean, that's obviously a testament to what Svelte can do in terms of DOM manipulation and how quickly it can do it. But also just the fact that we can do this in the browser is amazing. I was listening to a podcast the other day about by John Romero, the guy who actually wrote Wolfenstein 3D. And when he retells like the struggles they had back then to build this stuff on the hardware that was available, and now running this on primitives that are absolutely not made for it in a browser.
I didn't know about that, but I definitely will try.
Yeah, the running joke is you can run Doom on anything, and it sounds like Wolfenstein's in that. The craziest one I've seen is Doom rendered only with CSS checkboxes, where the checkboxes are individual pixels on the page. It's nuts. And you can throw Svelte on top of that if you want to, but it's crazy that hardware has caught up this much, where, yeah, all these frameworks are going to run stupidly fast.
I was about to say, I saw it on the Apple Touch Bar at one point, and that one just blew my mind. I was like, there's no way that's running right there, but it is. Maya, did you want to add a fun view story?
You thought I'm doing this, right?
I did. I was like, I'm gonna pick on you, but
Well, I think the only thing I saw until now is that someone trying to make a Nux app inside a not Google, sorry, a Microsoft Word documents in the hackathon, that they build some kind of like a plugin for Office, and the plugin is actually a Nux application. I have no idea how they do it. But yeah, so that's just weird.
that's I mean, people do some very amazing things with the technologies that we build or provide, and it's very interesting to see just how far people are able to push the boundaries. I swear, you give somebody SQL and they build a full application with it. I'm like, I don't know why you did it, but you did it, and that's really cool. So it's always interesting to see how life goes.
Oh, by the way, I have another one more thing. This is actually funny because a couple years ago, someone that working in a company that they have their own infrastructure, like they have their own web, kind of like their own web, the dark web, but it's not the dark web; it's the web for security and so on. So they're not using the normal web, and they have their own system, they have their own everything, and the guy took the source code of Vue and placed it in their repository, they structure the code base structure, the whole entire source code of Vue, put it there, and then make the UI for us. I think back then it's a C# web form, like applications that is for. I wouldn't say that what it is for, just that it's for a very highly security project. And they took the entire things and put it there, and somehow it works. Like they make it, and then they config, like they make it, they turn it into the actual Nux kind of like server-side rendering a UI for the project, and I'm just amazed of how they can just do that.
It's always very incredible. Well, I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us today. Those in the audience, thank you for participating. Loved reading the chat as we were talking. Loved the questions that came in. We look forward to you all joining us in our next event. We thank our panelists. We thank you. We hope you have a wonderful. Today's Tuesday, so have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday, and we hope to see you all at our next event. I'm supposed to do this. So thanks for joining, and we'll see you later.
Thank you very much again.
Thank you.